Detective Marcus Thompson had been walking the same beat for 15 years. The downtown district knew him well. Shopkeepers would wave from their windows, and even the homeless population respected his fair approach to law enforcement. But something had changed in Marcus over the past few months. The job was getting to him in ways it never had before. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday evening. Marcus was responding to a noise complaint at a small apartment building when he encountered James Miller, a young college student who was simply trying to get home after a late study session. James had his hands full with textbooks and groceries when Marcus approached him on the sidewalk. "Stop right there," Marcus called out, his voice carrying an unusual edge. James turned around, confused and slightly startled by the aggressive tone. The rain was getting heavier, and both men were getting soaked. "Officer, is there a problem?" James asked politely, adjusting his grip on his textbooks as water dripped from his hair. He had always been taught to be respectful to law enforcement, and despite his confusion, he maintained his calm demeanor. Marcus studied the young man with suspicious eyes. Something about James bothered him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Maybe it was the stress from his recent divorce or the fact that his department had been pushing officers to make more arrests to meet quotas. Whatever it was, Marcus felt an irrational anger building inside him. "Turn around and put your hands against the wall," Marcus ordered, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. James's eyes widened in shock and fear. He had done nothing wrong. He was simply a student trying to get home safely. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding," James said carefully, his voice trembling slightly. "I live in that building right there. I was just coming home from the library." He gestured toward the apartment complex with a slight nod of his head, afraid to make any sudden movements. But Marcus was beyond reason now. The combination of personal stress and professional frustration had created a dangerous cocktail in his mind. He grabbed James roughly by the shoulder and spun him around, pressing him against the cold, wet brick wall of the building. "I said, turn around," Marcus shouted, his voice echoing through the narrow alley. James's textbooks scattered across the wet pavement, their pages immediately beginning to soak up the rainwater. The groceries followed, apples rolling into puddles and milk cartons splitting open. James complied immediately, pressing his palms against the rough brick wall. His heart was racing, and he could feel the cold rain soaking through his jacket. He had never been in trouble with the law before, and the situation felt surreal and terrifying. "Please, officer," James said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. "I haven't done anything wrong. You can check my ID. I live in apartment 3B in this building. My name is James Miller, and I'm a student at the community college." Marcus began searching James roughly, his movements becoming increasingly aggressive. He was looking for something, anything that would justify his actions. But James was exactly what he appeared to be, a hard-working student with nothing more dangerous than a calculator and some pencils in his pockets. The search yielded nothing, which only seemed to make Marcus more frustrated. He pulled out his handcuffs and clicked them around James's wrists, the metal cold against the young man's skin. James winced at the tight fit but didn't complain, afraid that any protest might make the situation worse. "You're under arrest," Marcus announced, though he hadn't yet decided what charges he might fabricate. The power he felt in that moment was intoxicating, and it clouded his judgment completely. He had crossed a line that he had never crossed before in his career. What neither Marcus nor James knew was that this particular street corner was under surveillance. Not by the regular police department, but by a special unit that most people had never heard of. The Royal Guards unit was an elite law enforcement division that monitored police misconduct and stepped in when officers abused their power. High above, in an unmarked building, Agent Sarah Chen was watching the entire incident unfold through advanced surveillance equipment. She had been tracking Marcus for several weeks after receiving anonymous tips about his increasingly erratic behavior. The department had been looking the other way, but the Royal Guards unit answered to higher authorities. "We have a situation on 5th and Main," Sarah spoke quietly into her radio. "Officer Thompson is making an unlawful arrest. The subject appears to be innocent. Student, no criminal record, no weapons, no contraband found during illegal search." The response came back immediately. "Units are en route." "Ida, 30 seconds." Sarah watched as Marcus roughly guided James toward his patrol car. The young student wasn't resisting, but his fear was obvious even through the surveillance cameras. This was exactly the kind of police overreach that the Royal Guards unit was designed to prevent. Marcus was fumbling with his keys, trying to unlock his patrol car while keeping a grip on James, when he heard the sound that would change everything. It was subtle at first, the whisper of approaching vehicles with engines so quiet they were almost inaudible. Then came the soft thud of car doors closing simultaneously, followed by the measured footsteps of highly trained personnel. James felt Marcus's grip tighten on his arm, and he could sense the officer's sudden tension. Something was happening, but from his position against the patrol car, James couldn't see what it was. The rain continued to fall, creating a curtain of water that limited visibility. "Officer Thompson," a calm, authoritative voice called out from the darkness. "Please step away from the civilian and place your hands where we can see them." Marcus spun around, his eyes trying to pierce through the rain and darkness. What he saw made his blood run cold. 3 figures in dark tactical gear were approaching, their faces partially obscured but their professional bearing unmistakable. These weren't regular police officers, and they weren't here to help him. The lead figure stepped into the light of a nearby street lamp, revealing the distinctive badge of the Royal Guards unit. Marcus had heard whispers about this organization in the department, but he had always assumed they were just rumors, stories told to keep officers in line. "I'm Agent Chen with the Royal Guards unit," the woman announced, her voice carrying absolute authority. "You are currently engaged in unlawful detention and abuse of police power. Release the civilian immediately." Marcus's hands began to shake as the reality of his situation hit him. He had always thought he was untouchable, that his badge gave him unlimited power, but now he was face to face with officers who had authority over him, and they had clearly been watching him for some time. Marcus stood frozen in the rain, his hand still gripping James's arm as he stared at the 3 Royal Guard agents surrounding him. The streetlight cast eerie shadows on their faces, and their calm professionalism was more intimidating than any aggressive display of force would have been. "I said release the civilian." "Officer Thompson," Agent Chen repeated, taking a step closer. Her voice remained steady, but there was an unmistakable edge of warning in her tone. "This is your final opportunity to comply voluntarily." James could feel Marcus's grip trembling on his arm. The young student was still pressed against the patrol car, handcuffed and confused about what was happening. He had never heard of the Royal Guards unit, and he couldn't understand how these new officers had appeared so quickly and silently. "Who are you people?" Marcus demanded, though his voice lacked the confidence he was trying to project. "I'm conducting a lawful arrest." This suspect was acting suspiciously in the area. Agent Chen pulled out a small device that looked like a tablet and held it up so Marcus could see the screen. The display showed crystal clear footage of everything that had happened in the past 20 minutes. Marcus approaching James, the unnecessary rough treatment, the illegal search, and the baseless arrest. "We have complete surveillance of your actions tonight, Officer Thompson," Chen said calmly. "The civilian you have detained is James Miller, a 22-year-old college student with no criminal record. He was walking home from the library with groceries and textbooks. There was no suspicious behavior, no probable cause for a stop, and certainly no justification for arrest." The second agent, a tall man with graying temples, stepped forward. "I'm Agent Rodriguez," he introduced himself. "We've been monitoring your patrol patterns for the past 3 weeks, Officer Thompson. This isn't the first time you've overstepped your authority." Marcus felt the color drain from his face. They had been watching him for weeks. How had he not noticed? His mind raced as he tried to remember other incidents that might have been recorded. There was the teenager he had roughed up outside the convenience store, the homeless man he had arrested for asking for change, and the woman he had pulled over simply because she had looked at him the wrong way. "That's impossible," Marcus stammered. "I would have seen surveillance teams. I know this neighborhood better than anyone." The third agent, a woman with short brown hair, smiled grimly. "The Royal Guards unit uses technology and methods that regular law enforcement isn't aware of, Officer Thompson. We have resources and authority that extend far beyond what you're accustomed to dealing with." James was listening to this exchange with growing amazement. These agents weren't just regular cops with different uniforms. They seemed to operate on an entirely different level. Their equipment was more advanced, their knowledge was more complete, and their authority appeared to supersede that of regular police officers. Agent Chen approached Marcus slowly, her hand extended. "Give me the keys to the handcuffs. Officer Thompson, Mr. Miller has been illegally detained for long enough. I'm not giving you anything until I see proper identification and understand what authority you think you have here," Marcus said, though his voice was shaking now. He was trying to maintain control of the situation, but it was slipping away from him rapidly. Rodriguez pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing credentials that Marcus had never seen before. The badge was different from any law enforcement agency he knew, and the identification card had security features that looked more advanced than FBI credentials. The Royal Guards unit operates under direct federal authority, Rodriguez explained. We investigate police misconduct, corruption, and abuse of power. When local departments fail to police themselves, we step in. You've been under investigation for excessive force, illegal searches, false arrests, and intimidation tactics. Marcus's knees felt weak. A federal investigation meant his career was over and potentially much worse. Federal charges could mean prison time, and he knew how police officers were treated in federal prison. His mind flashed to his ex-wife, his children, his mortgage. Everything he had worked for was crumbling around him. This is harassment, Marcus said weakly, making one last attempt to assert his authority. I'm a decorated officer with 15 years of service. I've never had a sustained complaint against me. Agent Chen laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. Never had a sustained complaint because your department covers for officers like you. But we don't answer to your chief, Officer Thompson. We answer to people who actually care about justice. She held up her tablet again, this time showing a different screen. It contained a comprehensive file on Marcus, including photographs of every questionable incident from the past 6 months, witness statements that had been buried by his department, and even audio recordings of conversations where he had bragged about intimidating civilians. Your department may have looked the other way, Chen continued, but the Royal Guards unit has been building a case against you for months. Tonight was just the final piece of evidence we needed. James was still pressed against the patrol car, but he was beginning to understand that his situation had changed dramatically. These new officers weren't here to arrest him. They were here to arrest the cop who had been abusing his power. The relief he felt was overwhelming, but he was still afraid to move or speak. The handcuff keys, Officer Thompson, Rodriguez said, extending his hand. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. Marcus looked around desperately as if hoping for backup to arrive. But he realized that even if other officers showed up, they wouldn't be able to help him against federal agents. His radio had been silent all night, and he wondered if the Royal Guards unit had somehow blocked his communications. With trembling hands, Marcus reached for his keyring and found the small key for the handcuffs. He handed it to Rodriguez, who immediately moved to James and began unlocking the restraints. Are you injured, Mr. Miller? Rodriguez asked gently as he removed the handcuffs. James rubbed his wrists where the metal had been cutting into his skin and shook his head. Just scared, James admitted quietly. I didn't understand what was happening or why I was being arrested. I was just trying to get home. Agent Chen nodded sympathetically. You weren't being arrested for anything you did wrong. Officer Thompson here has a pattern of targeting innocent people when he's having personal problems. Unfortunately, you happened to be in the wrong place when he decided to take out his frustrations. Marcus watched as his victim was freed and treated with the respect and dignity that he should have shown from the beginning. The contrast between his behavior and that of the Royal Guard agents was stark and humiliating. He could see his reflection in the patrol car window, and he barely recognized the man staring back at him. Officer Thompson, Chen said, turning her attention back to him. You're under arrest for civil rights violations, false imprisonment, assault under color of authority, and abuse of police powers. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Marcus Thompson, who had spent his career arresting others, was now hearing his own rights read to him by officers whose authority superseded his own. The rain continued to fall, washing away any pretense that this night would end with anything other than the complete destruction of his career and possibly his freedom. As Agent Rodriguez finished removing James's handcuffs, the young student stepped away from the patrol car and began picking up his scattered belongings. His textbooks were soaked and most of his groceries were ruined, but he was grateful to be free. The Royal Guard agents watched him carefully, making sure he wasn't injured and giving him space to process what had just happened. Marcus stood in stunned silence as Agent Chen approached him with her own set of handcuffs. These weren't the standard police-issue restraints he was familiar with. They looked more sophisticated and had some kind of electronic component built into them. These are federal custody restraints, Chen explained as she saw him staring at the handcuffs. They have GPS tracking and biometric monitoring. Once they're on, our central command will know your exact location and vital signs at all times. The reality of his situation was beginning to sink in fully. Marcus realized that this wasn't just a departmental disciplinary action or a temporary suspension. The Royal Guards unit operated on a completely different level, with resources and authority that made his local police department look like amateurs. Before we proceed, Agent Rodriguez said, "I want you to understand exactly what's happening here, Officer Thompson. This isn't about one bad night or a momentary lapse in judgment. We've been building a comprehensive case against you, and tonight's incident was simply the final straw." He pulled out a thick folder and began reading from it. March 15th, you arrested 17-year-old Kevin Santos for looking suspicious outside a pizza restaurant. The charges were dropped when surveillance footage showed he was simply waiting for his food order. March 22nd, you conducted an illegal vehicle search on Maria Gonzalez during a routine traffic stop, causing significant damage to her car interior. No contraband was found, and she filed a complaint that was mysteriously lost by your department. Marcus's face grew paler with each incident Rodriguez recited. He had assumed that his department's protection would keep these incidents buried. But apparently the Royal Guards unit had access to information that his superiors couldn't suppress. April 3rd, you used excessive force during an arrest of Michael Washington, a homeless veteran, resulting in 3 broken ribs and a concussion. The incident was ruled justified by internal affairs, but we have independent medical testimony that contradicts their findings. James listened to this recitation with growing shock. The officer who had just illegally arrested him wasn't having one bad night. He was a serial abuser of police power. The young student felt sick thinking about all the other innocent people who had suffered at Marcus's hands. Agent Chen took over the reading. April 18th. You intimidated witness Sandra Phillips when she tried to report domestic violence in her neighborhood, telling her that snitches get stitches and that she should mind her own business. As a result, the domestic violence continued for 2 more months until the victim was hospitalized. Marcus tried to interrupt. You're taking these incidents out of context. Police work is complicated, and sometimes you have to make quick decisions under pressure. May 2nd, Chen continued, ignoring his protest. You planted evidence during a search of David Kim's apartment. Mr. Kim spent 3 weeks in jail before a public defender noticed inconsistencies in your report and had the evidence tested. The drugs you claimed to find contained your fingerprints but not Mr. Kim's. This last revelation made James gasp audibly. Planting evidence was beyond simple abuse of power. It was a serious felony that could destroy an innocent person's entire life. He looked at Marcus with disgust and fear, realizing how close he had come to becoming another victim of this corrupt officer. The third agent, who had been silent until now, stepped forward and introduced herself. I'm Agent Williams, and I specialize in investigating police corruption networks. Officer Thompson, we know you haven't been acting alone in all of these incidents. We have evidence of a systematic pattern of misconduct involving several officers in your department. Marcus's eyes widened in panic. If the Royal Guards unit knew about the other officers, if they knew about the informal network of cops who covered for each other and shared in the profits from planted evidence and false arrests, then this investigation was far bigger than just his own actions. We know about Officer Bradley's gambling debts and how you helped him steal money from evidence lockers, Williams continued. We know about Sergeant Murphy's arrangement with certain defense attorneys to throw cases in exchange for cash payments. We know about the quota system your captain implemented that encouraged false arrests to boost statistics. Each revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. The Royal Guards unit hadn't just been watching him. They had been investigating his entire department, building a case that could potentially bring down dozens of corrupt officers and their supervisors. This is bigger than you realize, Officer Thompson, Williams said. You're not just facing federal charges for your own actions. You're looking at potential conspiracy charges, RICO violations, and civil rights charges that carry mandatory minimum sentences. James stood quietly, still holding his wet textbooks, as he witnessed the systematic dismantling of a corrupt police officer's career and life. Part of him felt sorry for Marcus, who looked completely defeated and terrified. But then he remembered the fear and helplessness he had felt just minutes earlier, when he was being illegally arrested, and his sympathy faded. Agent Chen moved closer to Marcus with the electronic handcuffs. You have a choice to make right now, Officer Thompson. You can cooperate with our investigation, provide information about your co-conspirators, and potentially receive some consideration for your cooperation, or you can remain silent and face the full weight of federal prosecution on your own. Marcus looked around desperately, as if hoping this was all a nightmare from which he could wake up. The rain had stopped, but the damage to his life was irreversible. His career was over, his reputation was destroyed, and his freedom was in jeopardy. If you cooperate, Rodriguez added, you might be looking at 5 to 7 years in federal prison instead of 15 to 20. Your choice, but you need to decide now. The weight of this decision was crushing. Marcus knew that if he cooperated with the Royal Guards unit, he would be branded as a snitch by his fellow officers. But if he didn't cooperate, he would face decades in prison and financial ruin for his family. James watched this internal struggle play out on Marcus's face. The officer who had seemed so powerful and intimidating just minutes earlier now looked broken and small. The young student was getting his first real lesson in how quickly power could shift and how justice, when it finally arrived, could be swift and merciless. I need time to think, Marcus said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of traffic from the nearby street. You have 30 seconds, Chen replied firmly. Our investigation is moving forward with or without your cooperation. The only question is whether you want to help yourself or make things worse. The electronic handcuffs gleamed in the streetlight as Agent Chen held them up, waiting for Marcus's decision. The next few seconds would determine not just Marcus's fate, but potentially the fate of an entire network of corrupt police officers who had been abusing their power for years. Marcus stared at the electronic handcuffs in Agent Chen's hands, his mind racing through 15 years of memories, mistakes, and moments where he had chosen the wrong path. The 30 seconds felt like hours as he weighed his options, none of which offered him the life he had known just 1 hour earlier. Time's up, Officer Thompson, Chen said quietly. What's your decision? Marcus took a shaky breath and looked at James, the young student whose life he had nearly destroyed for no reason other than his own personal frustrations. The guilt hit him harder than any physical blow could have. How many other innocent people had he hurt over the years? How many lives had he damaged to protect his own interests and those of his corrupt colleagues? I'll cooperate, Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll tell you everything I know about the department, about the other officers, about all of it. Agent Williams nodded approvingly. Smart choice. It won't undo the damage you've caused, but it might prevent future victims and could reduce your sentence significantly. James felt a complex mix of emotions as he watched this exchange. He was relieved that Marcus had chosen to cooperate, but he was also horrified to learn that there were other corrupt officers still out there, still abusing their power and victimizing innocent people. Before we transport you, Rodriguez said to Marcus, we need to secure your weapon and radio. The Royal Guards unit has protocols for handling federal arrests of law enforcement officers. Marcus slowly removed his service weapon and handed it to Rodriguez, followed by his radio badge and other equipment. Each item he surrendered felt like another piece of his identity being stripped away. He had defined himself as a police officer for so long that he didn't know who he was without the uniform and the authority it represented. Agent Chen carefully placed the electronic handcuffs around Marcus's wrists. As soon as they clicked shut, a small LED light began blinking, and Marcus could feel a slight vibration indicating that the GPS and biometric monitoring systems were active. Mr. Miller, Agent Williams said, turning her attention to James, we're going to need you to come with us to provide a complete statement about tonight's incident. We'll also need you to testify before a federal grand jury when this case goes to trial. James nodded nervously. He had never been involved in anything like this before, and the thought of testifying in federal court was intimidating. But he knew it was the right thing to do, not just for himself, but for all the other victims of police corruption. Will I be safe? James asked quietly. I mean, if there are other corrupt officers out there and they know I'm testifying against one of their own. Agent Chen smiled reassuringly. The Royal Guards unit takes witness protection very seriously. We have resources and capabilities that regular law enforcement agencies don't possess. You'll be completely safe throughout this process. As they prepared to leave the scene, James looked around at the scattered remains of his groceries and soggy textbooks. The simple act of walking home from the library had turned into a life-changing experience that would connect him forever to a federal investigation of police corruption. Don't worry about your belongings, Rodriguez said, noticing James's concern. We'll compensate you for everything that was damaged tonight, plus any additional expenses related to your testimony. A black SUV pulled up silently to the curb, followed by two more identical vehicles. The precision and coordination of the Royal Guards unit continued to impress and intimidate. James, these weren't ordinary law enforcement officers. They operated with a level of professionalism and resources that seemed almost military in nature. Marcus was guided into the first vehicle by Agents Chen and Rodriguez, while Agent Williams remained with James. You'll ride with me, she explained. We're going to a secure facility where you can give your complete statement and where our psychologists can help you process what you've experienced tonight. As they drove through the city, James stared out the window at the familiar streets that suddenly seemed different to him. How many other corrupt police officers were out there patrolling these same streets? How many other innocent people were being victimized while the regular system of police oversight failed to protect them? Agent Williams, James said quietly, how long has the Royal Guards unit existed? I've never heard of it before tonight. Williams glanced at him in the rearview mirror. That's intentional. We operate in the shadows because police corruption often extends to the highest levels of local and state government. If corrupt officers knew we existed and how we operated, they would find ways to avoid detection. She explained that the Royal Guards unit was created after several high-profile cases of police misconduct had exposed the inability of traditional oversight mechanisms to address systematic corruption. When local internal affairs departments are compromised, when district attorneys depend on police cooperation for their cases, and when mayors and city councils prioritize politics over justice, someone has to step in with real authority and independence. James was fascinated despite his exhaustion and trauma. How do you find out about officers like Thompson? Do people report them to you? Multiple ways, Williams replied. We have sophisticated monitoring systems that flag patterns of behavior. We receive tips from whistleblowers within police departments, and we actively investigate when we notice statistical anomalies in arrest records, evidence handling, or complaint patterns. The SUV pulled into what appeared to be an ordinary office building, but James noticed the subtle security features, cameras that were more advanced than typical surveillance equipment, reinforced windows, and guards who were clearly not ordinary security personnel. Meanwhile, in the first vehicle, Marcus sat silently between Agents Chen and Rodriguez, contemplating the complete destruction of his life. His wife had already left him, his children barely spoke to him, and now his career and freedom were gone as well. The only thing left was the possibility of reducing his prison sentence by helping to bring down the network of corruption he had been part of for years. Officer Thompson, Chen said as they pulled into the same parking garage, I want you to understand that your cooperation needs to be complete and honest. We already know more than you think we do, so any attempt to lie or mislead us will only make your situation worse. Marcus nodded weakly. He knew that his only chance of survival was to tell the truth about everything: the evidence planting, the false arrests, the money skimming, the protection of violent officers, and the systematic intimidation of witnesses and whistleblowers. The vehicles entered a secure underground parking garage, and James realized that this facility was far more sophisticated than it appeared from the street. Multiple levels of security, advanced screening equipment, and personnel who moved with military precision all indicated that the Royal Guards unit had resources that most people couldn't imagine. As they exited the vehicles, Marcus and James made brief eye contact. The corrupt officer and his innocent victim were now both swept up in a federal investigation that would expose years of systematic abuse and potentially send dozens of people to prison. This is where your new life begins. Mr. Miller, Agent Williams said to James as they walked toward the elevator, by standing up to corruption and agreeing to testify, you're helping to protect countless other innocent people from experiencing what you went through tonight. James squared his shoulders and walked into the building, ready to play his part in bringing justice to a system that had failed so many people for so long. Behind him, Marcus Thompson was led away in electronic handcuffs, beginning his own journey toward accountability and consequences that were long overdue. The secure facility of the Royal Guards unit was unlike anything James had ever seen. As Agent Williams led him through multiple security checkpoints, he noticed that each level required different biometric scans and clearances. The technology was years ahead of what he had seen in movies, and the personnel moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of extensive training and serious purpose. "This way, Mr. Miller," Williams said as they entered an elevator that required her fingerprint and a retinal scan to operate. "We're taking you to the Witness Processing Center on the 7th floor. It's designed to be both secure and comfortable for people in your situation." Meanwhile, Marcus was being processed 3 floors below in the Federal Detention Center. The electronic handcuffs had been replaced with standard restraints, but the GPS monitoring anklet they attached to his leg was a constant reminder that his every movement was being tracked by sophisticated equipment. Agent Chen sat across from Marcus in a sterile interview room, a stack of files and electronic devices spread across the metal table between them. "Before we begin your formal debriefing, I want you to understand the scope of what we're dealing with here. Your cooperation could help us dismantle one of the most extensive police corruption networks we've encountered in the past decade." Marcus looked up from the table, his eyes red and exhausted. "How extensive are we talking about?" 47 officers across 6 precincts, Chen replied matter-of-factly. "Millions of dollars in stolen evidence money, hundreds of falsified reports, dozens of innocent people imprisoned on planted evidence, and at least 3 cases where evidence tampering allowed actual criminals to escape justice." The numbers hit Marcus like physical blows. He had known that corruption was widespread in his department, but he had never imagined the true scope of the network he had been part of. The realization that his actions had contributed to letting real criminals go free while innocent people suffered was almost too much to bear. Upstairs, James was being interviewed by Agent Williams in a completely different environment. The Witness Processing Center looked more like a comfortable hotel suite than a government facility, with soft lighting, comfortable furniture, and even a small kitchen area. "We want you to feel safe and comfortable while you help us," Williams explained as she offered James a hot cup of coffee and a sandwich. "What you experienced tonight was traumatic, and we have counselors available if you need to talk through your feelings about the incident." James accepted the coffee gratefully, his hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline and shock of the evening. "Agent Williams, can I ask you something? How do you deal with knowing that there are so many corrupt officers out there? Doesn't it make you lose faith in the entire system?" Williams sat down across from him, her expression thoughtful. "It's exactly because there are corrupt officers like Thompson that organizations like ours exist. For every corrupt cop we expose, we're protecting hundreds or thousands of innocent people from becoming victims. That's what keeps me motivated." She pulled out a tablet and showed James photographs of other victims of police corruption, people of all ages, races, and backgrounds who had suffered at the hands of officers who abused their power. These people didn't have anyone to protect them when they were victimized. But because you're willing to testify, we can prevent future victims and get justice for past ones. Back in the detention center, Marcus was beginning to understand the magnitude of his situation as Agent Chen laid out evidence files. Photographs, audio recordings, financial records, and witness statements painted a picture of systematic corruption that stretched back years. "Let's start with Officer Bradley," Chen said, opening a thick file. "We know he was your partner in the evidence room theft operation. We have video surveillance of both of you taking money from drug seizure packages and replacing it with fake bills." Marcus stared at the photographs showing him and Bradley in the evidence room, clearly removing cash from sealed packages. The surveillance had been so well hidden that neither officer had suspected they were being recorded. "Bradley has a serious gambling problem," Marcus admitted quietly. "He owed money to some dangerous people and he was desperate. I started helping him because I thought it was just temporary, but it became a regular thing." "How much money are we talking about over the past 2 years?" Chen asked, making notes on her tablet. Marcus calculated in his head, the numbers making him feel sick to his stomach. "Probably around $200,000 total. Maybe more. We always told ourselves we were just taking money from drug dealers, so it wasn't really stealing from innocent people." Chen showed him another set of photographs. "But some of that money came from seizures that were later ruled illegal, wasn't it? Money that should have been returned to innocent citizens who had their property wrongfully taken." The question hit Marcus hard. He had never thought about the fact that some of the money they stole might have belonged to people who were eventually proven innocent. The rationalization that they were only stealing from criminals suddenly seemed pathetic and self-serving. Meanwhile, James was providing his detailed statement about the night's events to Agent Williams. She recorded everything carefully, asking specific questions about Marcus's behavior, the illegal search, and the intimidation tactics he had used. Did Officer Thompson say anything that suggested he had done this type of thing before? Williams asked. James thought carefully before answering. He seemed very comfortable with the whole process, like he had done it many times before. When I asked what I had done wrong, he didn't even try to give me a real reason. It was like he expected me to just accept being arrested without any explanation. Williams nodded, making notes. That pattern of behavior is consistent with what we've observed in other cases. Officers who regularly abuse their power often become careless because they assume they're protected by the system. As James continued his statement, he began to realize how lucky he had been that the Royal Guards unit was watching. Without their intervention, he could have ended up in jail on false charges, with a criminal record that would have destroyed his future prospects. What happens to Officer Thompson now? James asked when they finished recording his statement. That depends partly on how cooperative he is with our investigation, Williams replied. But regardless of his cooperation, he's facing serious federal charges that will likely result in several years in prison. His career in law enforcement is over permanently. 3 floors below, Marcus was indeed cooperating fully with Agent Chen's investigation. The weight of his crimes and the futility of resistance had broken down all his defenses. He was providing names, dates, methods, and details about the corruption network that went far beyond what the Royal Guards unit had suspected. Sergeant Murphy wasn't just taking bribes from defense attorneys, Marcus revealed, his voice hollow with exhaustion. He was also selling information about ongoing investigations to criminal organizations. Drug dealers knew about raids before they happened. Witnesses were intimidated before they could testify, and evidence disappeared from cases that were getting too close to people Murphy was protecting. Chen's expression remained neutral, but internally she was shocked by the scope of the corruption Marcus was describing. Do you have any evidence of these activities? Documents, recordings, photographs? Marcus nodded slowly. Murphy made us all keep insurance files, evidence of each other's crimes so that no one could betray the group without destroying themselves. I have recordings of him talking about the bribes, and I know where he hides the cash payments. This revelation changed everything. If Marcus could provide evidence that led to Murphy's arrest, and if Murphy had similar evidence against higher-ranking officials, the investigation could potentially reach into the highest levels of the city's law enforcement and political establishment. Where are these insurance files? Chen asked, leaning forward with interest. Murphy has a safety deposit box at First National Bank under a false name, Marcus said. He made copies of everyone's files and stored them there. If anything happened to any of us, he planned to use those files to bring everyone else down with him. Agent Chen immediately called for additional teams to secure the bank and obtain warrants for the safety deposit box. The investigation was expanding rapidly, and they needed to move quickly before word of Marcus's arrest spread through the department and evidence could be destroyed. Back upstairs, James was finishing his statement when Agent Williams received an urgent message on her secure communication device. She read it quickly, her expression growing serious. Mr. Miller, I need to ask you to stay here tonight for your own safety, she said. The investigation is expanding rapidly, and we've learned that the corruption network is much larger than we initially thought. Until we can arrest the other officers involved, you could be in danger. James felt his stomach drop. You mean they might try to hurt me to stop me from testifying? It's a possibility we have to take seriously, Williams replied honestly. But you'll be completely safe here. This facility has security that rivals federal prisons, and we have agents who specialize in witness protection. The reality of his situation was becoming clearer to James. He wasn't just a witness to one corrupt cop's misconduct. He had become a key witness in a federal investigation that could bring down dozens of corrupt officers and expose systemic problems in the city's law enforcement. As the night wore on, more Royal Guard agents arrived at the facility. Teams were being dispatched across the city to execute search warrants, make arrests, and secure evidence before it could be destroyed. The investigation that had started with Marcus Thompson's abuse of power was rapidly becoming one of the largest police corruption cases in the city's history. Marcus continued his debriefing session with Agent Chen, providing details about the network's operations that painted a picture of an organization within the police department that operated more like a criminal enterprise than a law enforcement agency. Captain Reynolds knew about everything. Marcus admitted as dawn approached. "He took a cut of all the money we stole, and he protected us from internal affairs investigations. Anytime someone tried to file a complaint against one of us, Reynolds would make sure it disappeared or was ruled unfounded. The implications were staggering. If the captain of a major precinct was involved in the corruption, it meant that the rot in the department went all the way to the top." Agent Chen realized that by the time this investigation was complete, it might result in the largest police corruption prosecution in the state's history. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows of the secure facility, both Marcus and James were facing the reality that their lives had been permanently changed by the events of one rainy night. Marcus was beginning a journey toward prison and disgrace, while James was starting a new role as a federal witness whose testimony would help bring justice to a corrupt system. The Royal Guards unit had arrived before anyone could blink, and their swift intervention had prevented one more innocent person from becoming a victim while exposing a web of corruption that had been destroying lives for years. 6 weeks had passed since that rainy night when James Miller's simple walk home from the library had exposed one of the largest police corruption scandals in the city's history. The Royal Guards unit had worked around the clock, executing search warrants, making arrests, and building cases that would eventually send dozens of corrupt officers to federal prison. James sat in a comfortable witness preparation room, reviewing his testimony with Agent Williams one final time before the federal grand jury proceedings began. The young student had lost weight during the weeks of preparation and protection, the stress of being a key federal witness taking its toll on his normally calm demeanor. "Are you ready for this, Mr. Miller?" Williams asked, noting the tension in his shoulders and the way his hands shook slightly as he reviewed his notes. "I know this has been overwhelming, but your testimony is crucial for securing convictions against not just Officer Thompson, but the entire network." James nodded, though his voice was uncertain. "I keep thinking about all the other victims, the people who didn't have the Royal Guard watching when they were attacked by these officers. Some of them are still in prison because of planted evidence, aren't they?" Williams's expression grew serious. "Yes, unfortunately. We've identified at least 37 cases where innocent people were convicted, based on evidence that we now know was planted by Thompson and his associates. The good news is that we're working to overturn those convictions and secure their release." The scope of the corruption had grown far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. Captain Reynolds had been arrested at his home 2 weeks earlier, along with 17 other officers spanning multiple precincts. The safety deposit box that Marcus had revealed contained evidence of corruption reaching into the district attorney's office, the mayor's administration, and even the state police. Down the hall in a maximum security holding cell, Marcus Thompson sat in orange prison clothing, preparing for his own appearance before the grand jury. The electronic monitoring ankle bracelet had been replaced with traditional shackles, and his face showed the weight of the consequences he was facing. Agent Chen visited him one final time before his testimony. "The plea agreement is still on the table, Thompson. 7 years in federal prison, full restitution to victims, and permanent exclusion from law enforcement. But only if your testimony helps us convict the others." Marcus looked up at her with hollow eyes. "My children won't even speak to me anymore. My ex-wife changed their last name so they wouldn't be associated with me. 7 years might as well be forever. The alternative is 25 to life without the possibility of parole," Chen reminded him coldly. "The choice is yours, but this is your last chance to do something right with your life." The federal courthouse was surrounded by media trucks and protesters as the grand jury proceedings began. News of the corruption scandal had shocked the city, and public trust in the police department had plummeted to historic lows. Citizens who had long suspected police misconduct finally felt vindicated, while others struggled to accept that officers they had trusted were actually criminals. Inside the courthouse, James took the witness stand and began recounting the events of that night 6 weeks earlier. His voice was steady despite his nervousness, and he provided clear, detailed testimony about Marcus Thompson's unprovoked attack and illegal arrest. "The officer never gave me any reason for stopping me," James testified. "I was simply walking home with groceries and textbooks when he approached me aggressively. When I asked what I had done wrong, he became more hostile and violent." The federal prosecutor, a seasoned attorney named Rebecca Martinez, guided James through his testimony with precision. "Mr. Miller, Did Officer Thompson's behavior suggest to you that he had done this type of thing before? Yes, absolutely, James replied. He seemed very comfortable with the process of illegally searching and arresting someone. It felt routine to him, like he had done it many times before and expected to face no consequences. When it was Marcus's turn to testify, he walked to the witness stand in shackles, his head down and his shoulders slumped in defeat. The transformation from the arrogant, abusive officer of 6 weeks earlier was complete and shocking. State your name for the record, Prosecutor Martinez requested. Marcus Thompson, former police officer with the Metropolitan Police Department, he answered quietly, the word former carrying the weight of his destroyed career. Over the next 3 hours, Marcus provided devastating testimony about the corruption network he had been part of for over 5 years. He detailed the evidence-planting operations, the theft of money from drug seizures, the protection of violent officers, and the systematic intimidation of witnesses and whistleblowers. Captain Reynolds ran the operation like a criminal organization, Marcus testified. He took a percentage of everything we stole, and he made sure that any internal affairs investigations were buried or discredited. Officers who refused to participate were transferred to other precincts or driven out of the department entirely. The grand jury listened in, shocked silence as Marcus described how the corruption had become so normalized that officers openly discussed their criminal activities during shift briefings. It wasn't seen as wrong anymore, he admitted. We convinced ourselves that we were just taking from criminals, so it didn't matter. But I know now that some of the money we stole belonged to innocent people whose property was illegally seized. Agent Williams testified about the Royal Guards Unit's investigation, describing the sophisticated surveillance operation that had documented hundreds of incidents of police misconduct over several months. Officer Thompson's attack on Mr. Miller was just the tip of the iceberg, she explained. Our investigation revealed a systematic pattern of abuse that affected hundreds of victims over several years. The electronic evidence was overwhelming. Video footage showed officers planting drugs during searches. Audio recordings captured them discussing how to fabricate reports, and financial records proved that they had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from evidence lockers. Captain Reynolds, when called to testify, initially tried to maintain his innocence, but when confronted with recordings of him discussing bribe payments and evidence tampering, his story crumbled completely. I was trying to protect my officers, he claimed weakly. The department put so much pressure on us to make arrests and seize assets that some of my men started cutting corners. I should have stopped it, but I was afraid of what would happen to their careers. Prosecutor Martinez wasn't buying his excuse. Captain Reynolds, these recordings show you personally collecting money from evidence thefts and discussing how to intimidate witnesses. This wasn't about protecting your officers. This was about personal enrichment at the expense of innocent citizens. As the grand jury proceedings continued over several days, the full scope of the corruption became clear. The network had operated like a criminal organization within the police department, with Reynolds at the top collecting tribute from his subordinates' illegal activities. James watched some of the testimony from a secure viewing room, and he was amazed by how many lives had been destroyed by the actions of these corrupt officers. Families had been torn apart by false arrests, innocent people had spent years in prison, and the public's trust in law enforcement had been severely damaged. Mr. Miller, Agent Williams said as they watched Marcus complete his testimony, I want you to know that your courage in testifying has prevented countless future victims. The Royal Guards Unit estimates that this network would have continued operating for years if you hadn't been willing to stand up to them. James felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride in doing the right thing, but also sadness for all the victims who hadn't been as fortunate as he was. What happens to the innocent people who are still in prison because of planted evidence? We're working with defense attorneys and civil rights organizations to review every case involving these officers, Williams replied. It's going to take time, but we're committed to overturning every wrongful conviction and securing compensation for the victims. The grand jury ultimately returned indictments against 43 individuals, including police officers, supervisors, and civilian conspirators. The charges ranged from civil rights violations and evidence tampering to racketeering and conspiracy. It was the largest police corruption case in the state's history, and it would fundamentally change how law enforcement was conducted in the city. As James left the courthouse after completing his testimony, he reflected on how one random encounter with a corrupt police officer had led to the exposure of massive systemic corruption. The Royal Guards unit had arrived at exactly the right moment, and their swift intervention had prevented him from becoming just another victim, while simultaneously bringing down an entire criminal network operating within the police department. 1 year later, James Miller stood at the podium of the University Law School's graduation ceremony, delivering the commencement address to a class of new attorneys who would soon enter the legal profession. The young man who had once been terrified during an illegal arrest was now studying law himself, inspired by his experience with the justice system, to dedicate his career to protecting civil rights. Justice isn't automatic, James told the graduating class, his voice strong and confident in a way that would have been impossible before his encounter with police corruption. It requires brave people to stand up when they see wrongdoing, even when it's dangerous or difficult. Sometimes justice arrives in the form of people you've never heard of, working behind the scenes to protect those who can't protect themselves. In the audience, Agent Williams smiled as she listened to James speak. The Royal Guards unit had continued to operate in the shadows, but their work on the police corruption case had led to significant reforms in law enforcement oversight. The city had implemented new transparency measures, independent oversight boards, and mandatory reporting systems that made it much harder for corruption networks to operate undetected. Marcus Thompson was serving his 7-year sentence at a federal minimum security facility, working in the prison library and participating in rehabilitation programs. The man who had once abused his power to intimidate innocent people was now teaching literacy classes to fellow inmates, trying to find some way to make amends for the damage he had caused. His former colleagues had not been as fortunate. Captain Reynolds received a 25-year sentence and was serving his time in maximum security. Officer Bradley, whose gambling addiction had started the evidence theft operation, was sentenced to 15 years. In total, 38 former police officers and officials were convicted and sentenced to terms ranging from 5 to 30 years in federal prison. The civil lawsuits that followed the criminal convictions had cost the city over $50 million in settlements to victims of police misconduct. Innocent people who had been wrongfully convicted were released from prison and compensated for their suffering, though many of them struggled to rebuild their lives after years of incarceration for crimes they didn't commit. Agent Chen had been promoted to lead the Royal Guards unit's expansion into other cities where similar corruption problems had been identified. The success of their investigation had led to increased funding and authorization to operate in multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. The Thompson case taught us that police corruption often operates like organized crime, Chen explained to a congressional oversight committee that was reviewing the Royal Guards unit's activities. Traditional oversight mechanisms fail because they're part of the same system that the corruption has infiltrated. External oversight with federal authority is essential for addressing systematic misconduct. The Royal Guards unit had grown from a small, experimental program to a permanent federal agency with offices in 12 major cities. Their sophisticated surveillance technology and investigative methods had been refined and improved based on lessons learned from the police corruption case. James finished his speech at the law school graduation and returned to his seat, where Agent Williams was waiting to congratulate him on his presentation. "You've come a long way from that scared college student standing in the rain," she observed with genuine admiration. "I had good teachers," James replied, looking at the agent who had guided him through the most difficult period of his life. "The Royal Guards unit showed me that the system can work when people are willing to fight for justice, even when it's dangerous or politically unpopular." Williams nodded thoughtfully. "Speaking of which, I have something to discuss with you. The unit is expanding our community outreach program, and we're looking for someone to help train civilians on their rights during police encounters and how to report misconduct effectively. Interested?" James's eyes lit up with interest. This was exactly the kind of work he had hoped to do after finishing law school. "You mean I could help prevent other people from going through what I experienced?" "Exactly," Williams confirmed. "We need someone who understands both the victim's perspective and the legal system's complexities. Your experience gives you credibility that no amount of training could provide." Meanwhile, in the federal prison where Marcus Thompson was serving his sentence, The former police officer was writing letters to the families of people he had wrongfully arrested over the years. The responses were mixed. Some victims' families appreciated his apologies and expressions of remorse, while others wanted nothing to do with him. "I know that saying sorry doesn't undo the damage I caused," Marcus wrote in one letter to the mother of a teenager he had arrested on false charges. "But I want you to know that I think about what I did to your family every day, and I'm committed to spending the rest of my life trying to make up for the harm I caused." The mother, Maria Santos, had initially thrown away the first several letters without reading them, but eventually curiosity got the better of her, and she read Marcus's latest attempt at communication. His words seemed genuine, and she was surprised to find that reading them provided her with some sense of closure. Maria's son, Kevin, had been traumatized by his wrongful arrest and had struggled with anxiety and depression for months afterward. The family had received a substantial settlement from the city, but the emotional damage was harder to repair than the financial harm. After much consideration, Maria decided to write back to Marcus. "Your apology doesn't erase what you did to my son," she wrote, "but it does help me understand that you recognize the pain you caused. I hope you use your remaining years to prevent other families from experiencing what we went through." The correspondence between Marcus and some of his victims became part of a restorative justice program that the prison had implemented specifically for former law enforcement officers. The program was designed to help both the perpetrators and victims of police misconduct find healing and closure. Back in the city where the corruption scandal had unfolded, the police department was slowly rebuilding public trust under new leadership. The new chief, who had been brought in from outside the department, had implemented comprehensive reforms including body cameras for all officers, independent investigation of misconduct complaints, and regular psychological evaluations to identify officers who might be at risk of abusing their power. "The Royal Guards unit saved our department from complete collapse," the new chief admitted during a community meeting. "Their investigation exposed problems that we either couldn't see or weren't willing to acknowledge. The reforms we've implemented as a result have made us better police officers and better servants of the public." Crime rates in the city had actually decreased following the corruption scandal. Contrary to some predictions that removing corrupt officers would harm public safety, it turned out that when police officers focused on actual law enforcement instead of personal enrichment and power abuse, they were much more effective at preventing and solving crimes. James completed his law degree and was accepted into the Royal Guards unit's community outreach program. His first assignment was to develop training materials for college students about their rights during police encounters and how to safely document potential misconduct. The goal isn't to create hostility between citizens and police, James explained to his first training class at the community college, where he had once been a student. "The goal is to create accountability that protects both innocent citizens and honest police officers from the damage that corrupt officers can cause." Agent Williams attended James's first community training session, proud of how far the young man had come since that terrifying night when his life had been changed forever. The Royal Guards unit's intervention had not only saved James from becoming another victim of police corruption, it had inspired him to dedicate his life to preventing others from experiencing the same injustice. As the training session concluded and participants asked thoughtful questions about their rights and responsibilities, Williams reflected on the broader impact of their work. The Thompson case had been just one investigation among many, but it had demonstrated that swift intervention, by properly authorized oversight, could prevent countless future victims, while holding corrupt officials accountable for their crimes. The Royal Guards unit continued to operate in the shadows, monitoring police departments across the country and standing ready to intervene when officers crossed the line. They arrived before anyone could blink when justice was needed, and their work ensured that corruption and abuse of power would face consequences that could not be buried or ignored by local politics and institutional protection. Justice had prevailed, but only because people like James Miller had been willing to stand up and testify, and organizations like the Royal Guards unit had been ready to act swiftly when corruption was exposed. The system worked when good people were willing to fight for it, and the price of freedom remained eternal vigilance against those who would abuse their power over others.